Developed by Ubisoft Montréal and published by Ubisoft at large in 2003, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time is a marquee linear action-adventure title directed by Patrice Desilets and produced by Janice Malone. The former having previously worked as lead designer on Donald Duck Going Crackers, and the latter having produced the Game Boy Advance version of Rayman. The game also features heavy contributions from the original series creator, Jordan Mechner, who served as writer, game designer, and creative consultant on the project. This is in contrast with Prince of Persia 3D, where Mechner merely served as design consultant. Unlike said predecessor, The Sands of Time was a rousing success that would come to influence its genre for years on end. Said genre bearing the ever-nebulous linear action-adventure label. When talking about 2D platformers making the transition to 3D, the subgenre of cinematic platformers is usually left out of the discourse entirely, and for good reason. I can barely think of any other series making the jump outside of Prince of Persia. Oddworld might be the only other one, but the moment-to-moment gameplay of Munch's Odyssey is so far removed from its two prequels that it goes into a new direction entirely. The Sands of Time, on the other hand, strongly embodies the spirit of its 2D counterparts while adeptly modernizing the concept of a Persian prince dodging traps to save the kingdom, leading to the linear action-adventure game we have in front of us today. They even go so far as to offer the first level of Prince of Persia in this new engine through a cheat code to really drive the point home. The genre umbrella of action-adventure is infamous for being everything and nothing at the same time, as by adding action and platforming elements to the adventure game formula of old, you can do just about anything you want. I define action-adventure games by these four pillars: plot, platforming, puzzling, punching. With all four equally balanced, you end up with the platonic ideal of an action-adventure game, which The Sands of Time comes close to. The scope is kept in check by making the game a linear set of levels, hence the linear modifier in linear action-adventure. With this established, let's talk about pillar number 1, the plot, and discuss how it's affected by The Sands of Time. The story of The Sands of Time is a story within a story of the most charming variety, very much in keeping with Arabian Nights itself. It begins with our prince entering the bedchambers of a woman and inviting her to listen to his tale, which promises to reveal the true face of time. As the story begins, the prince explains how he joined his father, King Shahraman, for an invasion of the Maharaja of India's palace, aided by the Maharaja's treacherous vizier who offered them help with the raid for a reward from the treasure vault. Gameplay soon begins, and the player gets to take part as the prince goes on his quest for honor and glory, striking down any Indian soldier barring him passage. This eventually leads to the treasure vault, where he finds the Dagger of Time, a magical relic with the power to reverse time a few seconds. Pocketing the dagger, he returns triumphant to his father and declares he has brought back honor and glory. The vizier is none too pleased with these turn of events, as King Shahraman denies him the dagger as his choice of reward. Instead, the king shifts his focus towards taking a giant hourglass he intends to present to the Sultan of Azad alongside exotic animals and a few dozen slave girls Shahraman is all too pleased to pick out himself. He commands that no animals nor maidens be harmed until he has made his choice. For King Shahraman is merciful in victory. One of these newly christened slave girls is Farah, the Maharaja's daughter, who's forced to join the king's victorious parade into the Sultan's palace. There, the two rulers greet each other with joy, thinking only of pleasantries while ignoring the human cost incurred during the invasion. The vizier takes this moment to act, exploiting the simple-mindedness of the men around him. He tricks the prince into using the dagger to unleash the sands of time from the hourglass, while Farah desperately cries out in despair. It's for naught, as the sands are unleashed, turning everyone in the palace save for Farah, the prince, and the vizier into vicious undead sand creatures. Gameplay kicks in again and has Farah reinforce her role in the plot as the voice of reason by teaching the player how to deal with sand creatures before running away from the prince. In these 25 minutes, the game has laid out all of its cards on the table, delivered the foundation of its thesis, and taught the player most of its mechanics in the process. When people talk about games needing a strong hook, this is it. What stands out to me the most is that nary a line of dialogue is wasted. I love it when scenes are densely scripted, especially intros like these. It shows that the creative forces behind it know exactly what's the most important to present in order to set the stage. It's a display of confidence and clarity of purpose, important tools for any storyteller. So what have they established here? After the core theme of time, the second thing established is the framing device of the story within a story that uses said theme. They present some important contrasts between the past prince and the present prince here. The present prince has this somber, regretful and introspective tone as provided by Yuri Lowenthal in one of his star-making roles.
Do you think I felt regret as I gazed upon the destruction we had wrought? Or at least humility at the speed with which a world can be transformed from a good world into a hell? If you think so, you are mistaken. For in that moment I thought of one thing only. The honor and glory I would bring my father by fighting like a warrior in my first battle.
The past prince, on the other hand, is a self-centered asshat I wouldn't trust with baking a pie, never mind ruling a kingdom. Only a short while separate the two, but it shows that even a small amount of time can make a difference. Something which holds true in gameplay as well, as the Dagger of Time can be used to correct a few seconds of mistakes and make that have large consequences. As with any bratty character, the blame lies in the environment in which they were raised, and the prince had no chance with a father like Shahraman. Here we have a warmongering fool who is proud to send his youngest son into a bloodbath in the name of honor and glory. A king who cares more for things than people, which is why he captured the latter as slaves to turn them into the former. And the man is so souped up on patriarchal violence that he considers this a mercy. He sees nothing wrong with his actions and seeks only to impress his friend, the Sultan of Azad, who has his own goddamn torture dungeon. To call these bastards birds of a scrotum feather is putting it lightly. The Vizier really has to pull his weight to stand out from these two as the main villain. We aren't privy to the prince's upbringing, but we don't need to see it. His position as youngest son to a father like King Shahraman tells all. Especially with how determined he is to prove himself worthy in his father's eyes, like his brothers had presumably done before him. With few words, the game paints the prince's starting point in the story as something truly appalling and invites us to learn what caused such drastic change in him. The answer is our heroine, Farah, who has gone mostly ignored by the game so far, thus reinforcing her starting point in the narrative. It's no accident that when the game presents a woman robbed of her culture and agency in a world of murder-happy men, hell breaks loose and everything collapses. It is through her that the prince expands his viewpoint and grows as a person. From here on, the game begins in earnest and has you control the prince as he journeys throughout the palace. Encounters Farah, works together with her, and eventually falls in love as his brash demeanor breaks down in tune with his clothing when faced with the reality of women and the world at large. Before he does that, he spouts some truly deplorable things out of his mouth, which caught me off guard with how evergreen this sort of characterization is.
I'll meet you at the baths. She orders me around as if I were a servant. It's my own fault. With women, you need to show them you're in charge right from the start, or they'll walk all over you. I've been too indulgent. Probably because I felt sorry for her. Well, it stops now. From now on, she'll have to toe the line. That is, assuming I can find her.
The majority of the game is a simple quest to reach the hourglass and stop the sands, so the plot remains very static until the end when the Vizier finally reminds you that he exists. That gives us a good 4 or 5 hours spent almost entirely on the character dynamic between the prince and Farah. Starting out, their relationship is understandably difficult, as the prince has recently lost the father he looked up to and Farah is trying to take her dagger back to fix this mess. After thematically opposing his monstrous father by killing his sand creature form and losing the first chunk of his clothing, the prince convenes with Farah for the first section where she acts as an NPC companion. Unlike the demure player-led Yorda from Ico, Farah is wholly independent, as demonstrated in the first section here where she immediately challenges his presumption about her being slow by running ahead. Halfway through the ensuing battle, she even drops down to join the fray by disregarding the prince's orders. The game strikes a good balance with Farah's characterization, as she doesn't come off as a misandrous tosspot who's only here to chastise the men on screen for simply existing, while obviously not being a distressed damsel either. Instead, she is capable and empathetic, gives out well-deserved sass, sometimes needs help, and is even a bit of a romantic. She's a well-rounded and fully developed character who serves as an excellent foil to the selfish prince, and is a great template for NPC partner characters. Since we're privy to the prince's perspective, both in the past and present, nailing down when he realizes he loves Farah later in the game isn't difficult, save for resisting the urge to throw him down a spiked pit when he expresses it like this.
I could marry her. After all, she is a Maharaja's daughter. conquered one, but still, her blood is royal. Besides, what better way to tame her insolence? It's not so bad for a woman to have a little spirit. It's a challenge!
Farah's thoughts and feelings are kept at greater distance though, meaning both we and the prince have to try to puzzle her out as we grow more attached. When she fails to steal back the dagger at the start, she mentions how she's heard the prince is both kind and brave, which, given the low amount of information we are provided with, could be true. But she could also be lying, buttering up the prince in order to manipulate him into doing the right thing as she begs for help. When the two are later reunited before entering the Hall of Learning, Farah rests the head of a knocked out prince in her lap and anguishes over him leaving her. Here, she calls him my love. The prince barely hears this as he wakes up, causing some confusion in him, which he expresses the very second he is away from Farah and next to yet another inviting spiked pit.
She said my love. I know she did. I didn't dream it. At least, I think I didn't. It's quite natural, really. Her kingdom's conquered, she has nothing, no one to protect her. She needs me. I can see it in the way she looks at me. All I'd have to do is reach out and take her hand, and she'd be mine. Why am I talking to myself?
I think this wake-up scene is a minor failure of writing and direction, as we in the audience are pulled away from the prince's perspective, meaning we actually hear what she says and see how embarrassed she feels about doing so. So we know for sure she's already in capital L love, which feels a bit unearned at this point in the story. I think the simple intimate act of stroking his hair as he wakes up would have been enough of a hint and justified similar confusion. Especially with how Farah then loads a romantic Chekhov's gun afterwards, which turns into a gag because the prince is just that dense.
Listen to this. Of what use is reason against the power of love? Love is life. So if you want to live, die in love. Die in love if you want to stay alive.
What's that supposed to mean?
I thought you'd like it.
If you want to be useful, try finding a book that'll tell us how to get out of here.
This isn't that kind of game.
Game? She thinks this is a game.
All of this will they or won't they tension has been simmering for hours, but finally reaches a boiling point once the player has fought with every inch of their being to keep Farah alive in the ascent up to the hourglass. Here, the prince suddenly doubts their mission and Farah's intentions. Going by the text, this might seem to come out of nowhere since he hasn't expressed doubt in her for hours, but there is a good reason actually. Throughout the entire game, in a lovely bit of gameplay and story integration, the prince and the player have both become dependent on these sand vortexes which provide glimpses into the future and let you save. Most of the visions are straightforward gameplay hints, but interspersed within a few of these sequences are visions that depict different timelines and even the end of the game. And just before reaching the hourglass, the prince sees a vision of Farah stealing the dagger. This moment of weakness and doubt in Farah is all the Vizier needs to once again bring about chaos. The encounter ends with the troubled couple being sent down into a tomb thanks to a sandstorm. This is where the game gets weird. Understandably upset, Farah cuts into the prince for not trusting her, but quickly relents after realizing he has grown enough to take responsibility for his mistake. The scene, which has been strangely lacking in music so far, then suddenly cuts out the visuals as well, leaving the two in complete darkness. Even so, or perhaps because of these circumstances, the scene feels incredibly intimate as the now dressed down prince, wallowing in failure, takes Farah's hand. Lost in the darkness, he even expresses a moment of weakness owing to claustrophobia.
What is it?
Nothing.
You're trembling.
I just don't like close spaces. There must be some way out of here.
This gets Farah to try and console him by telling him of the secret word her mother told her to speak when she was afraid, so that a magic door would open.
I've never told that to anybody.
I can see why. It's the most childish thing I've ever heard of. What was the word?
Kakolukiam.
Kakolukia.
As soon as the prince repeats the word, the sound of moving stone can be heard as the room is relit with Farah nowhere to be seen. The prince jumps down into a now open grave, which takes him to a strange underground oasis at the bottom of a long staircase. Up to this point, the game has been very straightforward with what it depicts and the integrity of time and space. The only exceptions are the 10 secret areas leading to a fountain of Gatorade for the prince to partake of to increase his health. Afterwards, the entrance is magically gone without a trace, like it was never there. The game goes out of its way to make it extra weird the last time you do it by making it sound like someone else is speaking through a half-sleeping Farah.
I love it when you do that.
Come with me, please.
No, you go.
Once you return, she speaks in her normal tone again and is confused about the prince thinking he went anywhere.
Farah, how long have I been gone?
Gone? What are you talking about?
Never mind.
This odd interaction is then built upon at the bottom of the staircase, where the player has to chase Farah's strange voice through multiple teleportation doorways.
Where are you?
Take me in your arms.
I don't see you. What the... All right, this is getting ridiculous.
Eventually, the prince catches up with her in a radiant bathhouse where she invites him to swim. He does so, with them interlocking hands and the scene cutting away before we see anything spicy. And then...
Was it real, that magical cavern? If it was a dream, then it was a dream we both shared. I know it was. Farah. Oh no.
None of this is ever explained, lending the story a sense of magical whimsy, almost as if to compensate for all of the straightforward video gaming we've been doing so far. On one hand, the visuals represent the culmination of the relationship in a beautiful way, using strong direction to get past the age rating. But on the other hand, Farah has robbed the prince of his sword, make of that what you will, and the dagger, his agency, leaving him only with her defensive amulet. It's as if she says, "I love you, but you need to stay still so I can fix this myself." The prince obviously rejects this notion and goes chasing after her, leading into the final big chunk of the game. From here until the end, the player is bereft of the Dagger of Time, making any platforming mistake aggravatingly fatal all of a sudden. Combat, on the other hand, becomes a non-issue as the prince soon acquires the final sword upgrade, which is so powerful it simply disintegrates sand creatures. Narratively speaking, I believe this shift in circumstances is meant to raise the stakes for the climax, as well as underline what the prince is without Farah. He has grown and is thus more powerful on his own terms than he was before, but as you will quickly understand playing this section, damage numbers aren't the solution to everything. The Dagger of Time represents the special touch that makes the game as a whole stand out. Which also holds true when you take the dagger as a representation of Farah, since her existence in the plot greatly elevates the game. Playing without the dagger sucks and will get you frustrated dealing with the lackluster checkpointing, just like losing your soulmate sucks and lessens you as a person. The dramatic irony here is that Farah is now the one acting short-sighted and being uncooperative, just like the prince did in the beginning. So now it's his turn to reach out and act as the voice of reason, but no matter how quickly you chase her, it ends in tragedy. And for a third time now, in a moment of weakness for the prince, the vizier is there. Like a demon, he tries to tempt the prince once again. But enriched by love and consumed by hatred, the prince passionately declines and strikes at the hourglass, intending to die as he calls back to the poem Farah found.
Live forever, when those I loved are dead and I to blame. I choose death.
Then, the moment happens. Developed by Ubisoft Montréal and published by Ubisoft at large in 2003, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time is a marquee linear action-adventure title directed by Patrice Desilets and produced by Janice Malone. The former having previously worked as lead designer on Donald Duck Going Crackers, and the latter having produced the Game Boy Advance version of Rayman. The game also features heavy contributions from the original series creator, Jordan Mechner. Who is the reason this is a tale like none you have ever heard? The moment is the very reason time travel is worth the strain it puts on a narrative. It's when a gigantic turn of events, unbound by chronological constraints, throws the story on its head and leaves you in a daze. Time travel stories that don't do this did not understand the assignment. Even with such a short runtime, it's difficult to remember the exact context in which the story began, so seeing Farah alive again comes as a welcome surprise. The entire game, all that effort and strife, has been undone, and the prince is back to his full regal attire, only he wears it with more dignity now. And who decides to show up now if not the vizier, hellbent on taking back the dagger and achieve immortality? But due to the way drama works, he decided to pick a fight with the prince at his highest point. The ensuing battle is little more than a playable cutscene, as the vizier makes for a downright terrible final boss due to how seemingly random he is about what attacks work at what point. Not to mention that he has a single guy dying of tuberculosis, so he isn't exactly a match for our dashing rogue who has been defeating sand creatures by the dozen. The actual gameplay final boss, the Sand Griffin atop the Tower of Dawn, was cut during development, but the fight with the Vizier carries so much of the story's momentum that it ends up being a success nonetheless. When he is struck down, no attempt is made to give him any deeper meaning, which is fine as his motives are perfectly understandable while his methods are deplorable. It's fitting that the final destructive male figure we defeat doesn't even have the excuse of being turned into a monster. He already was one. But he was merely the catalyst of this story. What really matters is what happens to our two lovers. Farah is relieved the vizier was stopped, but questions the need for the prince to invent such a fantastic story. The prince takes this moment to clumsily give her a kiss, at which point she rejects him.
That I would believe such nonsense. I said I owe you thanks. You presume too much.
This part is important, as the game forgoes the Disney solution to the plot and has Farah remain unaware of the bond they shared together. The day may be saved, but what the prince wants most remains out of reach. Realizing this, the prince uses the dagger to undo the kiss and claim the story fake.
Do you think me a child, that I would believe such nonsense?
You're right. It was just a story.
Wait! I don't even know your name.
Just call me Kakolukia.
That brings the story of the Sands of Time to a close. I once called it simple, which as far as the moving parts go, it is. But once you dig into it, you see that it explores the virtues of love, the destructive force of greed, and just how important a little bit of time can be. It's a truly delightful and somewhat tragic coming-of-age story that sees our main character become as much of a complete person as the woman he loves. A far cry from the monster he was destined to become. Of course, there is an actual game here as well, one which I feel justifies its framerate cap of 30 FPS. Naturally, the PC version running at 60 has the potential to nullify the thrust of this entire section of the video, but good luck making that port behave as it should. With the industry staring down the barrel of a gun due to an unwillingness to accept the death of Moore's Law, graphics technology is in a bad spot. High-end PC gaming in particular. While the issues with image quality, shader compilation stutter, and frames made of lies are on everyone's mind, I would like to circle back to a lost art. 30 FPS games that look and feel okay. The Sands of Time is a game I feel truly justifies its framerate cap by both having a strenuous gimmick, keeping up to 10 seconds worth of elapsed game in memory for rewinds, while also looking gorgeous and selectively using both motion blur and bloom to great effect. The The game is mostly monochromatic, as the environments are bathed in golden yellows with a smattering of blues as contrast for good measure. Each level has been lovingly crafted to stand out from each other despite belonging to the same general location. My favorite little touches are the flap physics and the various sand clouds dotting the landscape. To get a better view of things, you can actually change to the landscape view of each room using the dedicated button. Playing like this often isn't the best, but sometimes it actually fixes some issues with the normal camera view. The fact that every room has its own landscape view makes me think that the game originally had a different camera system, or that they found this to be a quick solution to some of the more troublesome camera issues. The soundscape is a poorly mixed bag, as even on the highest volume, voices can be difficult to hear clearly.
Where are we?
This was the Sultan's zoo.
And even if you do, some of the lines are incredibly compressed for reasons beyond my comprehension. Though I hear the Xbox version addresses this, making it the definitive version since it also includes both original games and not just the first. The audio balancing wouldn't be so bad if the game had subtitles, but it doesn't, so you have to make do with lowering the sound effects and music while raising your master volume instead. But even when lowered, the music manages to leave a strong impression whenever a scene or battle sequence activates it. Stuart Chatwood went with the stereotypical video game desert instrumentation and some awesome backing vocals for the soundtrack. But as you can hear in this track, he also added the twist of some metal to the proceedings. Each track uses one or more of these aspects to craft a thoroughly enjoyable soundtrack that develops as you go along, feeling very much like a movie score without much repetition. But for as epic as it gets, my favorite track is the almost non-sequitur pure metal track building tension as the prince awakens in the prison. All the scene is missing is headbanging sand creatures from behind the bars. In keeping with the series' legacy, the platforming of the Sands of Time stands in defiance of 3D platformer conventions by making the abilities of the prince much more grounded thanks to its heavy usage of parkour. You can wall run, wall jump, pole swing, leap and roll all over the place in cinematic sequences that straddle the line between the achievable and the fantastical. I will take this opportunity to tell you to look up some parkour montages if you haven't done so in a while, particularly ones with horizontal pole swinging. It's amazing stuff. In the game, you can achieve some decent flow yourself by stringing together moves to traverse each platforming challenge. Each one is constructed out of just about every single combination of moves you can think of. The challenge lies in parsing the environment, picking the right move, and then using it with the correct timing if applicable. This sometimes happens under timed duress to make sure you have mastered your entire moveset. And if you haven't, the Dagger of Time is all too happy to undo your mistake should you have sand to spare. I don't know if the rewind or the highly lethal platforming begat the other, but they synergize very well, even symbolizing how both the prince and the player need Farah's help to grow via proxy. But once you've mastered each move, which in the case of the fickle wall jump might take a while, there really isn't much left to enjoy but the pure spectacle of this traversal fantasy. With every single ability except for the sparsely useful roll being highly contextual, there is simply zero player expression to be found. Every sequence is a sequence of linear motion, like a set of notes to follow. Doing so is pleasant, but they really have to get inventive to construct sequences that still feel fresh by the end of the game. Had it been longer, it probably would have become boring. Per genre tradition, there are some puzzles inserted into the environments to balance out all of the combat and platforming. You get introduced to the concept when you—
Can you help me activate the Azad defense system?
So, you
See those 4 axles? You'll need to pick them up one by one until you've got all 4. Then, bring them up to the top together.
then,
Make sure you pick them up in the right order.
after
Careful! If you pick the axle first, you'll have problems later.
keeping
That's it! I knew you could do it!
After this spirited introduction, the remainder of the game's puzzles are a lot less of a spectacle, with only one approaching anything difficult. It's really just your run-of-the-mill box pushing and the old light refraction puzzle dotting the landscape alongside some tricky traps. It doesn't challenge the mind, but it does give you some peace and quiet in between all the combat you'll be doing. Which is a lot, and might be awful depending on the choices you make early on and your qualities as a person. Combat in the Sands of Time is an infamous black spot on its record. I agree with the general sentiment, but it's not as simple as combat clunky and bad. The core of the issue has to do with rapid tutorials failing to teach the player how to do everything correctly, plus poor incentive towards experimentation leading to you pigeonholing yourself and suffering the consequences. The first few fights of the game are quick and easy, teaching you attacking, blocking, rolling, and volt slashing. Nothing presented provides a challenge, and the only complicated thing they want to teach you is that you can freely shift soft lock on targets mid-battle by turning towards them. This is the basis of the combat systems that will later appear in Assassin's Creed and Batman Arkham Asylum. The core idea of this sort of system is to provide a straightforward way for the player to fight multiple opponents at the same time without feeling overwhelmed thanks to semi-automatic targeting and enemies taking turns to attack. With the Sands of Time being the first iteration of this system, it naturally comes in a bit unpolished. The camera loves sticking to pillars and debris, which makes me wonder why these obstacles weren't removed or why certain rooms aren't bigger. The landscape view can certainly help, but depending on the room, how much it does can be a bit of a coin toss. Suddenly proved to be my ace in the hole during the infamous elevator battle at least. When attacking normally, the soft lock-on system works fine. I don't like how the animations look, nor how much the prince pauses between attacks, but we can chalk that up to some understandable lack of polish when establishing a new paradigm. Should one of these standard attacks be blocked, the game will very strongly have the attack bounce off the enemy weapon. This seems like the designer is telling you loudly, no, doesn't work, but it's actually a bit of a miscommunication, seeing as you can actually break through the guard of the lesser enemies eventually. This is a clear example of how the game is bad about establishing rules and expectations, something we will go into again later. After the story transpires, we are introduced to the little complication that makes sand creatures such a threat.
Prince, use the dagger. Strike with the dagger. Take his sand.
Attack all you like, but they will eventually regenerate and get back up unless you absorb them into the Dagger of Time. All of a sudden, target priority is a thing, and depending on the room you're fighting in, it can be difficult to hit the correct enemy on the ground with the dagger. In optimal circumstances, the only thing to look out for is not committing to a finisher while in range of another enemy winding up. Thankfully, once you are far enough into the retrieval animation, other enemies will stay their hand, otherwise this would be borderline impossible. Learning how to retrieve knockdown enemies is of vital importance, which is why they scream the information at you. But during this battle, they also try to teach you something else. Very poorly. I've actually shown the tutorial already. Did you catch it? And more importantly, did you actually parse it correctly? Here, let me show the moment again. Per my count, this tutorial flashed thrice during this battle, despite me doing a vault more times than that. Trying to read the text while you have like a second to provide correct input is an effort in futility. Especially if you haven't learned the normal vault slash yet, which had a similarly quick tutorial earlier. Attacking while vaulting comes rather naturally though, so I think most people catch on to it. But pairing a slash and a dagger strike in order to successfully do a vaulting retrieve is much more difficult. It's the sort of thing where pausing the game until the player hits the right button at least once would really help. Now, to own up to some foolishness, I actually learned this move during my second playthrough, but during the third, which is where the footage comes from, I completely forgot about it and mixed it up with the regular Vault Slash. Since I managed without it, we can say that it isn't vital, but it sure is convenient since it can instantly kill half of the game's roster for free without giving them a chance to retaliate. And just to make things worse, if you didn't parse that both buttons are part of the same command or misclick, you are likely to fail and accidentally do a Vault Freeze instead. A move which doesn't even work yet since the player hasn't absorbed enough sand to generate a power tank, so stabbing them with the dagger does nothing. You can even be as comically unlucky as me and do the input correctly right afterwards but get slashed out of it. Bad luck like that combined with the brief tutorial and the stress of the game's first real battle while recording meant I didn't internalize the vaulting retrieve. The game doesn't even provide a list of skills in the menu to help you. You read the manual, learn it here, or miss it entirely. The following battle only reminds you of your defensive options, with its true purpose being to provide enough enemies to fill up your first power tank, which will be at the center of the next tutorial battle. Before that, however, we are introduced to the Scarabs, the first sand animal enemy. Since the combat so far has only been challenging when fighting big groups of human foes, throwing just a few at you doesn't make much sense. But they still want brief, lesser encounters to spice up the experience, which is why sand animals are a thing. Be they scarabs, birds, or bats, all of these encounters are just annoying padding. They die quickly, but are often numerous and of little threat, so you really question their inclusion after the 7th bird in a row spawns in. The next tutorial fight is dense with information, as this is where they want you to try your combat sand powers as well as both types of parrying. First up is the slow motion power, which commits the cardinal sin of making the game into blurry sludge by slowing everything down. I think they want you to use it to make parrying easier, but I find that the enemies are slow enough to throw me off already, so I never used it much. The other one is the freeze, which disables one enemy and puts them into a waiver state the prince can exploit to kill them in 2 hits. It both eases up the situation and makes it easier to dispose of problem targets, even with the low range and it being blockable. The huge downside though is that killing a sand creature this way deprives you of sand. Not only do you not get a refill of your tanks, but you also don't make progress towards new power tanks either, which turns out to be very important later on. When they tutorialize the parry here, they do a much better job of it since you can just hold block and then calmly read the next input. But something you quickly learn after you get the hang of it is that there is no reason to ever use the normal counter when the dagger variant is an instant kill that gets you sand. It engraved itself in my psyche so hard the humble sword counter got completely forgotten. Which is totally fine, since it's objectively worse. Up until the game expects you to remember it exists and use it in an unintuitive way. This is also the battle where you will probably experiment with the healing system, as there is a water fountain in this room that you can access while fighting. I like how they use golden sand as a symbol of death and then contrast it with blue healing water filling your health bar. Overall, if you're determined enough, sneaking in some healing mid-fight isn't that difficult. But you already have a time rewind to exploit, so dying in combat wasn't going to be much of a problem anyway. No, the issue is how tedious it gets, but more on that later. The final core move is the rebound attack, which is a clean knockdown on most foes, assuming you can deal with the strict input window, aim it, and not have it be blocked. I didn't use it much, since it's oftentimes just a more difficult and more contextual Vault Slash with a higher rate of failure. Now, I can't exactly prove what I'm about to say here, but I'm confident that a lot of people will not have fully grasped all of these moves at this point. Instead, they will have relied on normal strikes combined with the Vault Slash to get by. So of course, this is when the game throws its second hardest battle at you and introduces enemies that are completely immune to vaulting. The Sand King fight is rough, downright spiteful even. To hell with introducing new concepts in a safe environment, to hell with healing mid-fight, you are dealing with 16 enemies in a row, 2/3 of which punish you for even attempting to vault, and are block heavy enough to almost require parrying. Here is where you learn to instantly delete red enemies with a vault, that rolling is not worth the risk of an accidental vault punish, that the block button stays taped down, and that the instant kill parry is your new god. Once that lesson has been hammered into you and you finally get to work out your frustrations on the Sand King, you realize he is a terrible nothing fight that's just a reskin of a later enemy. So much for catharsis. But now that you're a master of swords and acrobatics, far away from the remaining difficult fight in the game, what can the game even do to you? The answer is throw wave upon wave of enemies at you to slowly grind down your health and patience. Almost every time you think to yourself, wow, what a fight, you have just enough time to complete the thought before the next wave drops in, and then the next, and sometimes another one after that. For as much of a team building exercise this is with Farah whenever she's around to help, there are just too many enemies. The game does offer a solution to the problem it created, but it comes with a heavy asterisk. Once you've absorbed enough sand to match your power tanks with your sand tanks, you unlock the game's super move, the Mega Freeze. And if you don't mess up learning it like I did in my first playthrough, you will suddenly forget about the slow motion and regular freeze forever. I mean, look at this. It quite literally becomes the reduce enemy numbers to something sane button, making it a much more effective use of sand than anything else in the game. You don't save it, you don't skillfully execute it, you simply pray you can activate it as soon as possible and get back to the other aspects of the game. Which, thanks to the interesting design choice they made, isn't always possible. Whenever you collect enough sand clouds for a new sand tank, suddenly you can earn one more power tank, which means you aren't technically at max. Which means Mega Freeze is deactivated until you have absorbed enough enemies again. Which means you have to once again zero in on your most effective standard strategies before you can skip half an encounter again. And let's not forget that the game eventually introduces Sand Captains, the heavy boss-like soldiers with immunity to vaulting and the instant death parry, your primary tools of success. They also love to block on top of that, so what do? Well, when I played through this game, I just blocked, prayed, and got hits in during their wind-up animations. It's a slow and agonizing process that has you screaming out for a Mega Freeze to emancipate you from the tedium. I was so damaged by battles leading up to this point that I'd completely given up on experimentation. Things needed to die so I could go back to enjoying the environments and character writing. And that was my undoing, as I was told, much too late, that the hitherto useless sword parry counter could be chained to eventually bring down Sand Captains. I need everyone who has played this game and did not know this to voice off in the comments, because I sure as hell didn't. It's not in the manual, no tutorial pops up with advice, and nothing in the game invites you to ever use the sword counter when you can either instantly kill with the dagger counter or simply do an easy volt slash instead. Not to mention that they carry forward the same sort of dismissive animation and sound language as when you try to break through a block. Tell me this looks and sounds like I'm doing anything even close to correct until the captain just gives up. Oh, and their ground swipe, which is one of 2 attacks in the game that ignores block, you can skip over it with a neutral jump. Just thought I should mention that while I'm at it. All of this came to a head for me in the elevator battle, where the camera, an army of sand captains, and the small room boxing in Farah just became miserable. Not to mention that the sand cloud I picked up beforehand deactivated my Mega Freeze, making the entire fight an awful struggle to get enough sand to unlock it again and pulverize the last chunk of the encounter. And to top it all off, the final boss is a big bag of random attack immunities who is just no threat at all. Okay, so it's not the dream of Errol Flynning your way to victory by weaving through impossible odds. That's a shame. But if you actually know what you're doing and carry with you what I have now told you, it's fine. It's totally fine. Pretty good from time to time even. But due to the way they developed the game, they became blinded to how difficult it is to learn. In a lot of games, issues like these can be pasted over by lowering the difficulty or chugging health items. But the Sands of Time respects your abilities as a person and expects you to use all of its tools correctly within the intended framework with little wiggle room. I respect that stance, but if you want the player to be close to perfect, the game and its teachings also need to be close to perfect. When there's such a mismatch between knowledge and expectations, it just feels awful. If I were to replay the game right now, or going to the sequel, I'm sure I would feel a lot less frustrated and enjoy myself more after coming to understand these mechanics better. I just wish it was easier to come to this understanding after the game's first few hours instead of multiple playthroughs. Being innovative in the video game space is rarely an easy road. I can't imagine all the troubles Ubisoft Montréal ran into developing the Sands of Time, but their achievement should be celebrated. Action-adventure games are the complete package, meant to affect you on all levels. And in the right context, this game manages that by being emotionally resonant, interesting to look at, and challenging enough to get through. Sadly, more people than taste would dictate will not be able to achieve the right context to enjoy it on all levels. That important final 10% of polish is missing, meaning we have to look to one of its many successors and see if they can provide that perfect, magical action-adventure experience instead. Until then, I would like to take this moment to thank the contributors of the annotated script of the game on Genius.com and this article by Mark Filipovich for giving me a leg to stand on when analyzing the game's story and themes. I would also like to thank my friend for telling me about chain parries and jumpable attacks, which no doubt saved me many a corrective comment. Speaking of comments, let me know of your experiences playing The Sands of Time, especially if you played it when it was new, as I myself didn't have the opportunity. And if you'd like to see how many times I fell to my doom in my third playthrough, I do have a full let's play of the game available on my other channel, as linked below. Thank you for watching, and please make sure you're subscribed in time for the next episode, whatever it might be.
No, that didn't happen either. Let me begin again.